Welcome to Valley of Vietnam. I'm Bob Tribe, and our guest today is Steve Reed, who is a LRRP, Long Rang Reconnaissance Patrol team member with the 4th Infantry Division. So Steve, welcome.
Welcome, thanks.
Glad to have you, and thank you for doing this. You weren't born in Sacramento, but you've been here since 1961, so you've got a long history here.
Right, I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and grew up there, and then my dad worked for McDonnell Douglas, so we traveled to different places, Los Angeles, El Paso, Texas, and then finally settled down here in 1961.
So he was part of the space program?
Yeah, he started out working with Nike Ajax, the Nike Zeus program there with McDonnell Douglas. We were stationed at White Sands Proving Grounds there in New Mexico, right by El Paso, and then when the Apollo came into play, we moved to Sacramento because they tested the rocket engines here in Sacramento.
And later, while you stayed here in Sacramento, he ended up at Cape Kennedy.
He did. When the Apollo finally went into place and they did the moonshot, he actually went to Cape Kennedy, had an office in the blockhouse there. So we got Christmas cards from Neil Armstrong usually every year.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
You were living in the Fair Oaks area of Sacramento.
Yes, I grew up in Fair Oaks.
And you went to Bella Vista High School.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your time in high school and a little bit about your personal life then.
You know, we got here in '61, I think it was April of '61, and I enrolled at Bella Vista. Played varsity football, JV football there at Bella Vista High School. Went out for all the different sports while I was there. Kind of had a tumultuous childhood with my parents. Left home, go back, left home, bounced around to different houses, and I ended up living with the principal of my high school there.
Oh gosh. And he had a son who was one of your good buddies.
Yeah, his son Monty White and I were real close, and it was because of that relationship that I actually was able to move in with them. And I was given chores daily. We lived on the corner of Sunrise and Winding Way. There's now an AM/PM there, but there was a big pasture there, and we actually, I had to get up and help feed the horses and everything, and for my daily allowance and everything. So
even though you were kind of a little wild and crazy kind of guy, you were in kind of a strict relationship with this principal, and but your relationship with him was good.
My relationship with him was good, and he kept me on the straight and narrow. You know, something that needed to be done at that time.
So he was probably a kind of a prelude to having a drill sergeant later on in your life.
Well, he was a softer drill sergeant.
Okay.
He was softer.
Yeah, they were pretty tough. But you hung out at a lot of the regular places that a lot of us who grew up here did in high school, like the American River and Sam's Hofbräu.
Oh yeah, Country Club Center was a big place to go, you know, cruising K Street, inner tubing down the river, you know, from the Fair Oaks Bridge. One of the things that I did when I was in high school is, you know, we kind of got our man card by jumping off the Folsom Bridge. So if you could go to the 3rd pillar and jump off the Folsom Bridge, you were pretty macho in those days, and I did it lots of times, and the Rangers would come chase us, and we'd disappear and
That's
stuff
the old
like that.
Rainbow Bridge?
Yeah, the Rainbow Bridge there in Folsom.
Yeah, that's a pretty good drop. You played records at Tower?
Tower, yes. In the old days, they had the discs. And they had little booths that you...
I remember those. I was in those same booths.
Yeah, we would go in there, and of course, you know, the Beach Boys and the Dave Clark Five and the Beatles and all those things were just really neat things that, you know, the Beatles was a big thing growing up, and actually what ended up later in my life after I retired from the police department and worked, I actually was Paul McCartney's bodyguard. I was on stage with him for 32 of his songs, so It was really weird to follow that path.
You graduated from Bella Vista?
Yeah, 1965.
And you were working as a stock boy at Wine Stocks?
Correct.
At the one there at Arden and Watt? Or El Camino and Watt?
El Camino and Watt, yeah. John Parks was a manager there, and Roy Crumwoody was my boss there, and it was the first real 40-hour-a-week job that I had.
And you started at Sac State as a freshman?
Started at Sac State as a freshman, yes.
And that didn't work out so well?
No, I was on probation. I spent all my time, when I was supposed to be in class, I'd go to the gym and we'd play basketball and I'd cut classes, and I was on probation that year.
Right. So you left there and you went to out of state for a while.
Yeah, I was really tired of school. I think that's why I was on probation. I was just kind of tired of going to school and been bouncing around different houses and stuff like that, and I just wanted to get out and look around the world a little bit. So I ended up going to El Paso, back to where I grew up, and I stayed there for a little while, and then I flew to Wisconsin, where my family is from, and I ended up in Wisconsin Rapids, and I worked in a paper mill there in Wisconsin Rapids for the whole summer.
So you come back to California then, or what?
I came back. I didn't take a leave of absence from Sac State, so in the Vietnam War was a big thing then.
Right.
And we knew that if we went in the Army, we were most likely going to go to Vietnam. But I just didn't feel like I wanted to go back to school at that time. And so what happened is I flew back. I couldn't get back into Sac State because I'd taken a leave of absence. I hadn't done that. So I just thought it was time to go in the Army. I thought the Army would be a good experience for me, so I volunteered for the draft. And when you volunteer for the draft, you get to pick when you go in. You're only a 2-year commitment, but you get to pick. So I got to pick February of 1967, and that's when I went in.
Okay. And for basic training, most of the guys on the West Coast either went to Fort Ord or Fort Lewis up in Washington, but that wasn't the case with you.
No, I thought I was going to Fort Lewis, is where I thought, and we got on the plane, and I really didn't ask where we were going, and the next thing I knew, we were in South Carolina. So I went to South Carolina for processing, and then went to Fort Gordon, Georgia for my basic.
Okay. And then for advanced infantry training, you go back to Jackson?
Yeah, I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for my advanced infantry training.
Okay. Did you apply for any of the Army schools during that time, or?
I, at that time, had applied for OCS and I applied for flight school. I qualified for both of them through the testing, but because I had kind of a jaded childhood, they told me that the officer's actions were unbecoming an officer candidate. So
and a gentleman.
Yeah. So, at that time, I was still in my rehab, I guess.
Wow. I went through OCS, and I'll tell you, there were some guys there who weren't gentlemen, who just did fine. So you finish most of this training, and then you head for Vietnam in July.
Right. They sent me home. They give you 30 days, and my MOS was 11B, which is infantry. So I knew two things. I'm going to Vietnam, and I'm going to be in the infantry. So I knew that didn't seem like it was a great thing at that time. I came home for 30 days, and I got a notice from the Army after 14 days that I needed to go right away.
So they cut your leave in half.
So they cut my leave in half. Yeah.
So you arrive in Vietnam in the summer, which would be their monsoon season.
Yeah, I arrived in July of '67. My parents, I'll never forget the day. We went to the milk farm for breakfast.
Oh yeah.
Stopped at the milk farm. We went to Oakland, and of course we drank as much beer as we could before we knew we were going to get on a plane. And so we went to Oakland, drove to Travis, and then we got on a C-140, I think it was C-141, there at Travis, and we flew directly to Pleiku. We had one stop for fueling, and then we landed right in Pleiku.
I'm just going to back up just for a minute. You told me a story about meeting someone there at Travis who didn't have his family there to see him off, I guess, and so you invited him to sit with you and your family, right?
Yeah, there was a guy, an individual that was went through the training with me, and we were all there. Everybody sits outside in their cars with their families before they're going. Kind of an ominous hour or two, and his family had to go to a party or some kind of a get-together, and they left him there, and he still had about an hour to go, and he was just kind of lost, and I said, why don't you come and sit in our car? And so he came and sat with us, and he inevitably got killed 30 days before he was supposed to come back.
That's too bad. So anyway, you arrive in Vietnam. What was that like?
It was a total shock. I was 20 years old. And I'll never forget, we landed there in Pleiku at the airfield, and pouring rain. It was a monsoon season. Monsoons go from May till about October. And it was pouring rain, and I remember, you know, I'd been in rain before, but not usually in July, and it was quite a transition. And I was very fortunate. Central Highlands is a different, it's not like the muggy place down in the south. And it was cool, and it was raining a lot. And when we got off the plane, there was a group of soldiers getting on another plane. And they had their uniforms on, and they were laughing at us. And I remember them hollering, "Short, short," you know, and I didn't know. I thought they were talking about my height. I didn't know what they were talking about. And some of the guys that were experienced over there told me, said, "No, they're saying short because they're going home. There's no more time left for them." So I saw that, and you know, that was kind of a shock. But I could hear the artillery fire off in the distance. That's probably the biggest thing that really brought to light that this is a real thing, because I could hear the artillery fire going on in the hills around and stuff. And then I looked over to the left, and maybe about a quarter mile to the left were these aluminum coffins that they were loading on another plane. And just at 20 years old, that whole thing just really impacted me when I looked at that. It was the first time I became really scared. Yeah.
You get some initial orientation at Pleiku, which was the home base for the 4th Infantry Division.
Right.
Yeah. And somebody comes and talks to you about LRRP, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol.
Yeah, we were all ready to, you know, be assigned to different infantry units with the 4th, and they said, "Hey, you guys, we're going to take some time. There's some guys that want to talk to you." And these 3 guys came, and we were all sitting down on the ground. And we're looking up, and these guys come in these nice tiger stripe fatigues with cowboy hats turned up on the side, and man, it looked pretty glamorous, you know. They looked cool.
And that's unique from what all the other 4th Infantry guys were wearing.
Infantry guys wore their just olive drab uniform, you know, the greens, and the camis looked very special forces like, and like you were a special kind of guy doing special things. And of course we were 20 years old with a lot of testosterone in those days, and I remember they gave this presentation, said you're going to go out in small teams and you're going to work just with certain individuals the whole time, and you're going to be basically fighting the VC and the NVA on their terms, you know, on their grounds. So I volunteered. I signed a form, and then after that, I was going through the processing phase where we were finishing our processing for infantry, and I talked to the guy that was doing he was a clerical guy, and he went to Sac State, and he actually. And I went to Sac State, so we kind of had a conversation. I says, "Yeah, I signed up to join this LRRP thing, you know." And he goes, "Oh," he says, "I didn't see that here," but he says, I'll take care of you." And you know, there's about 20 of us that signed up, and I was the only guy that got in the whole thing. So it was because I just happened. Well, he did, because I don't know what they did with the sheet of paper, but I luckily was taken in the unit.
Well, you could say lucky, but on the other hand, maybe not so lucky. So this is something you had to volunteer for, and then you got some training to make you, you know, adept at this.
Yeah, we had about a month of jungle training, you know, rappelling out of helicopters. How to
Tell that story.
Yeah, the first time we had to rappel out of a helicopter, I'd never been. I wasn't really fond of heights. Yeah. And
except for jumping off of bridges.
Except for jumping, well, there was water below, not hard ground. Yeah. And I went up in a helicopter, and I remember they taught us that you put a Swiss seat on with a D-ring, and you wear a glove, and you got to get on the skid, and then you got to get perpendicular, and then you go down, you brake with your right hand. And I remember everything was fine. Got my Swiss seat on, my D-ring, and got on the rope and got out on the skid, and I looked down, and I says, "There's no way I'm going down this rope," and I crawled back in the helicopter.
And they let you.
They let me crawl back in, but they told me, they says, "You're going to get to try this again tomorrow. If you don't do it, you're going to an infantry unit." So I did it the next day, and I just had to overcome that fear. And once I did it so many times after that, it was easy. Yeah. But you know, it's just overcoming that initial thing, because I'd never done that before.
I know that feeling, because I've always had this fear of heights, and then I signed up for jump school, and that first time when you're going out the door, you're going, whoa. So,
But we learned how to do tracheotomies. We learned how to administer blood units. We learned
because you have no medic with you.
no medic. We had to do everything. So we had to learn how to do that. So, you know, it was, and then we had to learn there's certain tactics you use in a LRRP team as far as if you're compromised and if you make contact, you know, you peel off and you've always got a guy continuing the fire, so it's a continuous range of fire and stuff like that. But we went through all that training, you know, and stuff.
What was your first mission like?
My first mission was really a shock because we didn't make contact with. I was a LRRP then, and LRRPs were 4 to 5 man teams. You go out and they drop you in 4 to 6 grid square area where there's no friendly troops, and your job is not to make contact. Your job is to gather intelligence, to do surveillance, and just watch. So, you know, we had our green tiger stripes on. We painted our faces, and we just pretty much were invisible. We'd blend in, and my first mission, I remember, it was during the monsoon season, and I went out, and, you know, I was a new guy there, and I remember the biggest thing I remember at night, it was pouring rain, and they says, well, we're going to bed down here for the night. And you never bed down anywhere where it's flat. You're in the middle of all these sticker bushes and everything else. And I remember laying down there and didn't have any sleeping bag or anything, things you have in normal life. And I remember just laying in a puddle of water, just drenched.
Did you have a poncho?
I had a poncho, which did no good whatsoever because the water seeping underneath it anyways. And I just remember shaking and shivering. And then, of course, you hear every sound in the world. And because, you know, there's no street lights and there's no traffic and there's no, if you hear people, they're not friendlies at that time of the night. And I just remember laying in there shaking, and I mean, for shivering because it was so cold. And I remember thinking to myself, what the heck did I get myself into? Will I ever make it through a year of this stuff? You know, It was hard, you know, physically it was hard.
Many times when you do find the enemy, they're going to greatly outnumber you. So you have to be totally quiet. You probably can't use your radios or, you know.
We only used our radios 4 times a day, probably. I think it was about 4 times a day. We had the cryptic code that we would send in 4 times a day, telling our location and if we'd seen anything, what we'd seen, and then we'd shut them down. The old PRC 25s that we carried, you know, the team leader would carry that. And then we didn't really talk we go out, you know, anywhere from 7 to 10 days, and we didn't talk to each other. You just didn't talk. You did hand signals. If you woke somebody up, you squeeze them. You know, you didn't want them jumping up or anything like that. And there'd always be somebody awake when when it was time to bed down. There'd always be somebody that had to be awake. So, you know, we all covered each other.
So you're in this LRRP unit, but this is going to change in a couple of months. You're going to move into what they called a Hawkeye Unit. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well,
and how that differed from a LRRP.
Yeah, the commanding general was General Pierce, and he was from Iowa, and he had named these units Hawkeye units. And contradictory to what LRRP units were, LRRPs go out and they spend 7 to 10 days avoiding contact. Now, Hawkeye units get to pick and choose their contact. There were hunter-killer teams. There's only 3 of us. We had, I was a point man. My Sergeant Sejourné was a team leader, and Ashenfelter was a tail gunner. And we went out in a 4 to 6 grid square AO. We'd get dropped on these insertions, sometimes false insertions. They do until they finally put us in. And we would set up ambushes on the VC and the NVA, and we got to pick and choose what our targets were. Sometimes it was prisoner snatches, you know, and sometimes it was ambushes.
And so 3 men, how big a unit would you take on if you're going to do an ambush?
You know, it just depended on how we set up. If we set up with claymores and it would just depend on the terrain and the setting. In October of '67, we hit a group of 14 NVA soldiers. There was 3 of us. We killed 8 of them, and we got chased out because we didn't have communication. And I remember we were trying to get help back from the gunships, and what they do is they have what they call radio relay teams. Central Highlands is very mountainous, so they put a radio relay team on a mountain between base camp and where we were stationed.
Right.
And we didn't even have communication with them. So I remember them saying, if you're in contact, break squelch 3 times or that. And so we would break squelch. They knew we were in contact, so they had an idea where we were. And it was starting to get dark that night, so I know the gunships came and the helicopters, and they did extract us, but we were running for a little while.
Yeah. Now, was that the Friday the 13th incident?
Friday the 13th, 1967, yeah.
You'd get a 36-hour break after each mission.
They try to give you that, yeah. Just like my leave, something comes up, they cancel it, but you would stay up for 7 days, and you didn't sleep. I mean, if over 7 days, I'd say if you slept 10 hours over 7 days, you were lucky.
Right.
But you were in such a heightened state of anxiety and adrenaline, you really didn't need to sleep. But when you came in, you had to clean up all your gear, and then you needed time to sleep and to just, debrief yourself.
Sure. And you said you were very fortunate to have the team leader that you had.
Yeah, my team leader, I was very lucky. Guy Sejourné, he was from Haiti. He had been involved in warfare in other countries, guerrilla warfare. He was a staff sergeant, and especially when you've got 3 guys out there navigating through a jungle that you've never been in before. He could use the stars. He knew how to use the compass, and I remember a couple times when we'd be calling in artillery on a unit, he would call in artillery, and those things would fly over our heads, and you could hear the shrapnel coming through the trees. I was really glad he knew what he was doing, because some of those things could fall short on you, when you're a 3-man team.
So you're out in the field for 10 months, and then you get injured, right?
Yeah, I hurt my knee, and I ended up having to come in, and I just was in the base camp for a couple months. Yeah.
So how did you? So you came back to the States, but you still have some time to serve, 6 months or so, right, or more?
Right. Let me just backtrack. When I was off that 2 months, I would be part of that radio relay team that would go out.
Okay.
So that's what I did, for the other teams that were out there. So we'd go into a village and pretty much live in the village with the local folks. Yeah.
Yeah, we hadn't talked about that.
Yeah, I just reflected on it.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad
Yeah.
about that. So you head back to the States, and you're assigned to Fort Ord.
Correct.
Yeah. How did that transition go to suddenly be in that intense environment that you were in? And
Well, when you're over there, you put in a dream sheet where you want to go.
Right.
Everybody wanted to go to Fort Ord that was from California. That was the place to go. And once again, the luck of the draw, when I saw my dream sheet, I was stationed at Fort Ord. Everybody else went to Fort Hood, Texas. So I was very lucky to actually be stationed there. So I came home for my leave, and then I went down to Fort Ord. And I was assigned to G3 testing down there. I tested the guys that were just getting through the training.
basic training and seeing if they were proficient in the skills that they were supposed to learn.
Yes, and you know, I was an NCO, so I had NCO quarters. I had a CIB, and I had, you know, all the stuff that made you a god in their eyes, you know. And I remember one day that we were doing, I was testing somebody, and it was a low crawl thing through the thing, and I'm looking down, and I look at this guy, and it was a guy that I went to high school with. And he looked at me and he started talking to me. I remember all the other recruits and stuff were going, how can you talk to that guy? You're allowed to talk. I said, I went to high school with him, you know, but yeah.
Well, I remember when I first got in, I remember seeing guys with CIBs, combat infantry badge, with 2 stars above it, you know. And they hadn't been to Vietnam yet, but they'd been at the end of World War II in Korea, you know, so.
Well, of all the ribbons you get as a combat soldier, the CIB is the best. It's the most important one. I wear that proudly. I have a hat with it on there, and it you don't just get those, so you earn them.
So you got out of the Army in February '69?
Got out of the Army in February '69, yes.
Same time I did.
Bought a new Plymouth Roadrunner. I lived on $30 a month when I was in Vietnam, so everything went in the bank. And then when I went to Monterey, I bought a 426 Hemi Roadrunner. I said, I gotta do something for me, and I bought that. So.
Yeah. And you went back to Sacramento.
Well, I had a girlfriend at Chico State. I went up there for a little while, and then I ended up going to Sacramento. And Weinstock's had to give me a job back comparable to that. So the job they gave me was I got to bale trash. And I had a big baler down there, and I baled trash. So I thought, go to Vietnam and serve your country, and you get to bale trash when you come back. And the mood wasn't good when we came back. Sure. It was bad. And I don't know if I told you, when we landed coming back from Vietnam, we landed on the airstrip, and everybody kissed the ground. There was a ritual with us. And I remember a steak dinner, and you get your uniform. And they told us, I remember the sergeant telling us when we got our uniform, he says, make sure when you get home you take this thing off, you don't wear it around. And we've been gone for a year, and I'm going, man, I want to wear my uniform. I'm a sergeant and got all my medals, my CIB, and little did I know what the mood of the country was in those days, and it was that way even after I got out of the Army and we went back to Sac State, and I saw them spitting on recruiters and those kind of things.
But you finish and get your degree at Sac State.
I did. Well, I couldn't get into Sac State when I got
Because of
back.
your probation.
No, I couldn't get into Sac State because everybody wanted to be 2S. Right. Everybody wanted a deferment.
That's a student difference.
So I hadn't taken a leave, so they says, I'm sorry, we don't have room for you. So obviously being a Vietnam veteran didn't mean nothing as far as that. So I went to AR. I finished my AA at AR. Then the transition to Sac State. And actually I was going to be in broadcasting. I was going to be a disc jockey. I was a disc jockey at Sac State, but I was going to be in broadcasting. And until I met a girl that says, you should be a teacher because you get summers off and you get this and that and everything. And I kind of changed my direction. So I got my Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies, and then I had still my GI Bill left. It was $130 a month then. Right. I got my GI Bill, and I got 2 teaching credentials, my standard elementary and my standard secondary, so I can teach any grade, lifetime credentials.
So you started teaching after that?
I did. I started teaching in San Juan School District. I started at Jonas Salk.
Oh yeah, I know that school.
Jonas Salk, and then...
and what grades were you teaching?
I taught junior high. Okay. I taught English, history, reading, and spelling. It was called Core. Okay. So I taught there, and then I became a school administrator over at Sylvan, called a community school director. And I did that, and then I kind of acted as a vice principal part of the time doing discipline with the kids because it was kind of a wild time over there. And then I went to Barrett. And in the meantime, I had been kind of looking, I was a football coach at Rio Americano. And I coached varsity football, and then I also coached the Pig Bowl between the sheriffs and the city with Max Miller.
Okay. And did you start doing ride-alongs with the police department or something?
I did, and that's how I ended up transitioning to police work. I'd been a football coach, and part of the thing with Vietnam was after I got out of Vietnam, you still have this adrenaline thing. You want to keep doing something, and coaching supplemented that. That was a big deal, and then some of the guys said, well, you can go on a ride-along with me. And I says, oh, okay, I'll do that. And I went on a ride-along, and I go, oh, man, that is really, really cool. And I thought, I'd love to be a cop. And so, I had a little trouble earlier in my life, but it was nothing serious. And I thought, well, they're not going to take me. And he says, they'll take you with those minor things. You're not going to have a problem. So anyways, I took a leave of absence, and I went to the police academy and got through the police academy.
And when did you start as a policeman?
In 1981.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you did that for 20 years?
Yeah, almost 20 years, about 19 years, yeah.
And what sort of duties did you have as a police officer?
Well, I worked Vice, and I did the undercover stuff there. I did narcotics stuff. I did patrol.
You worked in Oak Park?
I worked in Oak Park 10 years out there, and then I had pretty high stats as far as arrests go, and Chief Kearns was a chief, and so they had wanted to do some experimental policing called community policing out there. It was getting into the community policing, problem-oriented policing, and so he put myself and Rich Lucero in Oak Park because they had a lot of problems to use traditional and non-traditional resources to affect long-term solutions to a problem area. And I was assigned to that, so successful. And in 1991, they decided to start what they call problem-oriented policing unit, and that's what I ended up as the first POP officer there.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then you were retired after 20 years?
19 years, yeah. I ended up getting injured, and then I had to retire. I was medically retired, yeah.
And you take on another new big job.
Yeah, well, I went back to teaching, and I taught continuation school out at La Entrada, which is I had a class of 8 kids, and probably 6 of them had ankle bracelets in those days. And you know, you're trying to teach them English, and most of the time I'm trying to show videos and talk about what the cop life's like. You know, they were more interested in that. And one day I got a phone call, and it was a guy, an old captain of mine. He was the chief of police in Walnut Creek, and he says, "Hey, I got a job you might be interested in." And I said, Rich, his name's Rich Gregson. I said, "Look, I don't want to move to Walnut Creek." He goes, no, it's in Sacramento. And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he says, "Well, it's Arden Fair Mall." And I said, "Oh, well," you know, and Arden Fair didn't have the best reputation in those days, you know. And I said, "Okay, well, let me go interview." And I ended up interviewing with the vice president of the management company there. And I ended up getting that job.
And how long did you do that?
I was at Arden Fair from 2000 until 2015.
And did you change the crime stats there at all?
We did. We did a lot of good things there. I've always believed that I'd rather beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. So, you know, I implemented license plate readers where we read license plates, scanned license plates on cars. At that time, there were 77 auto thefts in a year there. When I left, there were 4 auto thefts in a year there. I implemented a policy where you can't wear hoods inside the mall, you know, the hoods, sagging pants. We were not going to look at people's underwear inside there. Controversial, but fortunately I had a picture of a robbery that took place where a guy hid his face and circumvented my $1.5 million camera system, and we didn't even know who he was. So we got rid of the hoods, and we got rid of the stuff that looked.
I remember when that happened. It was in the paper, and they made a big deal out of it.
They made a big deal, and I dealt with the media, and I remember the B wanted to go their own way, and I said, "Well, okay, let me send you the picture of the guy that robbed a kiosk." And it was Steve Magnini, who's with the B, and you know, he was, I think they were going to go a different route, and when I sent him the picture, he says, "You know, we decided not to do the story." And you know, and I asked Walt Gray, good buddy of mine, I said, he wanted to do a story on it, and I said, "Do me a favor," I said, "go talk to the ACLU. You might as well get them on record what they're going to say." And they said they had no issue with it. And once they did it, it was like the Pope blessed it. You know.
Well, you have lived quite a story. Oh, I forgot to mention that after you came back from Vietnam, you were a boxer.
I was a boxer. Well, I was a boxer even before I went to Vietnam. Okay. And then I obviously didn't do it. And then when I came back, I started fighting again. And I fought at the auditorium and fought at the Elks Club. And I mean, guys like Bill McMurray, who just passed away, and Aristio Chavarone, and Freddie Roots, and Pete Ranzani came. Tommy O'Leary was my manager, and Ray Valine had my contract, and they also had Pete. So when Pete came in, he was just a new kid, and they wouldn't let us box with him because he was new, and he probably would have beat us in those days anyways, but we couldn't box with him. And, you know, I thought I was pretty good because I loved Muhammad Ali. He was my idol in those days, and I loved everything about him, and I thought I was pretty good. And I remember I was in the gym one day at O'Leary's gym down at 8th and L there. The old O'Leary's gym was up on there, and I boxed a guy, and his name was Tito Luna. And I remember I got knocked down 5 times, and I only remember the first 2. And I went home with a headache, and I go, I need to just keep going to school and forget this boxing thing, you know. So I was 24.
I think I remember too. You know, we used to hang out in old Sacramento when we were in high school. It was a rite of passage, you know, because we were out in that lily white suburbs, and, you know, old Sacramento just had so much color to it.
Diversity,
and all kinds of stuff happening. I just thought it was exciting. We'd shoot pool at the Tijuana room at 3rd and K, and but I think there was a boxing gym at the old Y, which is on the corner of 5th and J Street.
There was. And there was a guy named Chief that used to run it, a big old Indian guy. And we used to box down in the basement, yeah.
I remember the first thing I learned back in the 70s when I went to my first boxing match at the Memorial Auditorium, do not sit close to the ring, you know, because blood and sweat and everything would just fly all over you, you know. So
I just remember my first fights there, and I remember I had trained, and Jimmy Flood, an old-time guy here in Sacramento. Jimmy Flood was an All-American boxer. Yeah. He was my manager part of the time too, and and I remember training with him and stuff, and I thought, oh, I'm in good shape. And I remember when I got in the fight after the first round, I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm tired. I don't know how I'm going to do it. But Jimmy Flood and I used to spar, and of course he was a middleweight, and I got down to welterweight, and I remember he hit me once and broke my ribs. So, but Jimmy Flood was an icon here, and he passed away here a few years ago too.
You know, I'd like to kind of just finish this up by you telling us a little bit about all the veteran sort of stuff that you're involved with now, you know, helping veterans.
Yeah, I'm a board member of the Honor Group, which is a nonprofit that we have. One of the, I looked at different veterans groups, and one of the things I liked about the Honor Group was, number one, it was local. Number two, I knew where their money was going, and number three was one of their primary focuses is to invoke patriotism in kids, and they go around to schools, and we do assemblies, and we bring in vets, and we bring in speakers, and motivate these kids. We did one up at Del High School, and we had all the vets line up, and when we walked in, and they started playing Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, and the kids started chanting USA, 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 and I'm telling you, it choked you up.
Yeah, and it's sad that so many veterans came home, and you know what you went through, what so many of these guys who were in the infantry went through. None of these people could understand what that was like and the intensity of that. And then you got to go to college and be with people who will never maybe have any experience like that.
No, and the thing is that Vietnam affects you your whole life. It's affected me my whole life. You know, I've gone through 3 failed marriages. I've had issues with the drinking in the past, and I did go to counseling, and I did realize why I was doing a lot of the things that I did. But you know, you leave Vietnam, but Vietnam never leaves you. And you know, I can honestly say there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about Vietnam and that I don't reflect on it. But one of the things with when that happens is you're such an adrenaline rush, and you're younger, and you're working and working and working and working, and then all of a sudden you start waning down in your later years, and everything starts bubbling up, and all this stuff starts coming back, and you start realizing, you know, you reflect back on things, and you get sensitive. And when I left Arden Fair, there was going to be a void in my life. I knew that, and I saw that, and I said, you know what, I'm financially secure. I don't have to worry about the money thing, and I'm going to donate my time helping other veterans. So I've taken it on myself. I've probably taken about 17 veterans through the process of the VA. I've learned the VA how to navigate through it pretty well, and out of 17, 15 of them have gotten benefits out of it. I've got 2 still going, and we went down and filed their claim. A lot of vets just need to have their hand held. Sad as it may seem, they need to have somebody walk them through it, somebody care, somebody to personally talk to them and kind of lead them through that thing, and I'm fairly good at it. So.
Well, and the library recognized that and started this Veterans Resource Center here last year, and have volunteers staff it, and you know, I think it's been a big success. Maybe
I'll volunteer here too.
Yeah, well, that'd be great. Steve, I want to thank you for your service and for coming in today. You're going to be one of my heroes from now on.
Thanks.
That ends it for us today. We'll see you next time on Valley to Vietnam.